Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Eric Stover, Director of the Human Rights Center at UC Berkeley and an adjunct professor of public health. Eric has served as Executive Director of the Science and Human Rights Program of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and Executive Director of Physicians for Human Rights. He is the author of numerous books, including Witnesses from the Graves, The Breaking of Bodies and Minds, and most recently, The Graves, an account of human rights violations in the former Yugoslavia. Eric, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.
Any experiences in your childhood that pointed you in the direction of human rights work?
No, I was very lucky. I didn't have an abusive childhood, so I can't say that I suffered many violations of human rights. I was very fortunate. Perhaps in a way that may not seem evident, as a kid I really was a voracious reader, and I didn't shy away from taking on topics or at a young age reading Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, and so I think I got kind of fascinated with perhaps the darker side of life and what happened to people. I was particularly affected once as a child, having gone to the movie theater in the town I grew up in, and was during the newsreels at the time afterwards was a newsreel on the Holocaust and the concentration camps, and I was 6 or 7 years old, and I remember watching this and seeing the bodies and the film footage of the camps and when the Allied troops went into the camps, and then walking home with my brother, who was 18 months older, and sort of asking him about this, and then asking my parents, because they both served in World War II, and this was never discussed, and so I think that was an interest as to what, how could this sort of barbarity happen? And in a young child's mind, I started thinking about it early on, perhaps.
How old were you?
About 6 or 7 years old.
6 or 7. And was your family a political one?
No, not at all. My mother was very much involved in civil rights. She was a Chilean English descent, but not particularly. Nothing really significant. We grew up in Detroit and also in small farm towns around the Midwest.
As we will discuss in a few minutes, your work focuses in a way on human behavior and the application of science to the study of that behavior when things go wrong. What about this fascination with scientific methodology? Anything in your background that pointed you in that direction?
Not particularly. I think it really came from more of an idea. One of the authors I was very influenced by was Albert Camus, and Camus was interesting because, to me, in looking at the world, it basically said that the theory of absurdism is that things are going to happen. There are a lot of things you can't control, but if you learn to focus yourselves and if you have strong principles and interests, then you can accomplish something. And so when I looked at later on at the human rights movement, when I was involved, it was clear to me that often we create images of suffering and we need to motivate opinion and so on, but at the same time there's another process, and that is, how do you document this? If you're going to take it to the point of having trials of perpetrators, you need physical evidence, or there's a lot that science can teach us, or we know that people who go through massive trauma, whether individually or as collective groups, this resides in a community for decades afterwards, and a lot can be drawn from psychology and psychiatry and social work.
When one looks at your recent work, one is forced to ask the question, did you read Dante? Because so much of this work is at least a brief descent into hell to document what has happened.
Well, I read Dante. I also read Don Quixote.
Yeah, I see.
Where also you have people charging into windmills as well. So Yes, I did read Dante, and I can't say that I took that with me, I think.
Yeah. But you're suggesting that dealing with these realities that are so Dante-esque requires a scientific methodology, focusing on a piece of what's going on and really documenting it.
Well, it comes more in the problem-solving area of human rights, and by the early 1980s, we were now at a point in which there were going to be trials of perpetrators. So there were truth commissions being established throughout the world in different countries. Mm-hmm. And in that process of trying to collect the facts about what happened in the past, one of the terrible things of all of this repression was that there were thousands and thousands of people who disappeared, who were killed, tortured, executed, and buried in mass and individual graves. And a part of that process is trying to exhume those bodies, identify them, so the remains can be returned to the families, and so that the corpus delicti, the evidence that this is the homicide victim, can be presented in courts. And then perhaps an even overriding issue was, in Argentina, was the disappearance of hundreds of children who were abducted with their parents, or women who were in secret detention centers who gave birth to children. And the military and police took these children away and gave them up to adoption to childless military and civilian couples. So you had some 300 or 400 children out there that had been adopted illegally, and then their parents were killed later. And the grandparents of these grandchildren began searching for them. And the problem was 7 or 8 years had passed, and features on a child had changed, and the only way in court you could prove it was through DNA testing, taking blood samples from the children who were located with these families and the grandparents. So in a way, there was a need for science to step in at this time in the evolution of human rights work.
Now, the Argentine case is an interesting one. At that time, you were heading the Human Rights Program for the Association for the Advancement of Science. And so as the military regime left power, these issues arose. And this was about what year? This was in the early...
The military left power after 7 years of rule in 1983.
1983, okay. Yeah. And so at that point, people who had been aggrieved by the military, who had suffered these human rights abuse, were looking for justice and some sort of retribution. And so at this point, you really had an insight about how this problem should be approached.
Well, I was working for a science association, so I was involved in looking at individual scientists who'd been detained in any country, the Soviet Union, or disappeared in Argentina, and so on. And really, the idea didn't come from myself. It's interesting, as many of these things do, it came from the families in Argentina, because during the 7 years of military rule, up to 15,000 to 20,000 people disappeared. And the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo were formed, which were mothers who were looking for their daughters and their sons or their husbands who disappeared. And if there's one thing I've learned, and that is that there's no greater force on earth than a mother or a father who's looking for a disappeared child. I mean, these women would go out and march every week demanding information. What happened when the new civilian government came into power was that Raúl Alfonsín, who became president, instituted both a commission to investigate what had happened to the disappeared, and he also started trials of the 9 military junta leaders. And the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo who were looking for their disappeared children, who I mentioned earlier, or grandchildren, actually came to visit me in Washington, D.C., and they had one simple question, and that was, did I know of any way in which science or DNA analysis or paternity testing could be used, because they were locating these children. At the same time, President Alfonsín's commission had a problem, because when the new government came to power, the civilian government, people and judges, the families that disappeared and the judges went out to the cemeteries, and judges were ordering exhumations, and they were digging up these remains, skeletonized, and they were putting them in piles by the grave. And it was really an extension of the torture many of these people had suffered to the families. And so they needed to have orderly scientific process of carrying out this operation. So I was asked both by the grandmothers, out of their need to find some kind of testing, and also by the Alphonsine government to come in and find and to train a team to carry out the exhumations in a proper fashion.
And where did you go to find the expertise to deal with these problems? To the universities?
I knew that forensics was a new area to me entirely, and I simply called the National Academy of Forensic Sciences, which is based in Colorado Springs, and I said, who do I need? And they first pointed me to a forensic anthropologist called Clyde Snow. And really with him, it all began. We then put a team together. Usually in these cases, it's a multidisciplinary investigation. You need a pathologist, you need a forensic radiologist, archaeologist, anthropologist, odontologist. So a multidisciplinary team was put together to train a team in Argentina.
And the insight really here is to take scientific knowledge that had evolved out of departments of anthropology and I guess criminology basically, and apply them in this area where human rights violations are occurring.
Well, the association of science to the law has a long history. Forensic comes from the word forum, where you present in a forum science and a discussion. And so by bringing scientists into the courtroom, you're adding a new dimension to any sort of investigation. And this, because these scientists are going to be gathering the physical evidence, objective evidence. And while witnesses may forget things or change their minds on the stand, the scientific evidence is one that shouldn't forget. It's only the error in interpretation by forensic scientists who may make mistakes. But anyhow, when you look at why in the United States were we able to bring this team together, it really goes back to a very odd fellow, and that's Richard Nixon, who we owe the growth in the forensic sciences to, because
known for his commitment to human rights.
Really known for his commitment to human rights. But in the 60s, Nixon began his war on crime, and part of that was beefing up forensic labs around the United States. So a lot of these new forensic labs started drawing on university professors to become involved in forensic work domestically. And as I say in talks in Argentina and elsewhere, the reason we can bring this high-quality forensic expertise to you is nothing that we take pride in. It's because we live in a very violent country, and we've needed to develop these forensic sciences. So the opportunity here was to take these skills and apply it not just in individual cases, you know, a homicide in some county in Texas, or a flood that kills people in some other part of the country, but to apply it to a large social problem or human rights issue, like the disappeared.
Argentina was the first situation where this process of applying science to human rights issues began to emerge. But then what followed was a series of different countries where you and these teams were involved in demonstrating that human rights violations had been committed and you became part of the process to seek justice. Guatemala, Iraq, Cambodia, Bosnia, Rwanda, up until today. Why and by whom are these crimes committed in this era that we're now living through? Is this to be expected, or are we witnessing some sort of fundamental breakdown here?
Well, to stick with the topic of disappearance, disappearing people has a history. Throughout history, people have been kidnapped and disappeared. But when a repressive regime wants to make someone disappear, they do it for specific purposes. And that the night and fog decrees that were issued in 1941-42 by Hitler are a good example to go back in history, where the Nazi troops were encountering stiff resistance in the occupied countries, and in particularly in France. And so they decided to, what they didn't want to do was to go into these areas and just execute resistance fighters, because then you created martyrs and you created even a greater resistance. So what they did is they went in and they kidnapped and took them to German soil, away, where they were then put in camps and later executed. So you didn't create martyrs. No one knew what happened to them. Mm-hmm. They just disappeared. And so in a way, this was a technique that was used
of political terror.
Of political terror. And what happened in Argentina was that the military and police set up some 360 secret detention centers. They were trying to break the back of two very well-organized urban guerrilla movements. And they also wanted to erase communism, or liberalism even, within the country. And the best way of doing that was not filling your prisons up with political prisoners. But then you'd have Amnesty International sending letters saying, why don't you release these prisoners, and causing trouble. The way to do it was simply to abduct people at night, take them away to these secret centers, get the information out from them under torture, and then make them disappear, which means executing them and taking them and burying them in individual graves in cemeteries with no names. NANA is the designation. Or in mass graves on military encampments and facilities.
Now, this recent historical period, it's almost a spectrum from one end, political terror, moving increasingly to worse situations where in Yugoslavia and Rwanda, really genocide efforts to wipe out whole populations. To what do you attribute this resurgence of small case studies of what the worst thing that we've known, namely the Holocaust?
Well, there are many theories,
yeah.
And it's difficult to sort through them. I think one is clearly in the post-Cold War, or the peri-Cold War, meaning the Cold War is still in place, but it's slowly being dismantled, is that you had two superpowers keeping many countries in check by giving funding to shore up one particular leader and so on. And now that that's dissolved, you have a sense that there's much more intra or fighting within borders or simply across borders that superpowers aren't going to get involved in. Clearly Russia isn't going to get involved in it anymore. And the United States has been even more and more reluctant. And so it's been this lack of any pressure being put on to resolve these issues. And by pressure, political will, and that means, as we face today in Kosovo, is the fact that you need to show not only the threat of force, that you're willing to use force to end these conflicts. Each one, I think, has to be looked at contextually. I mean, what's happened to the former Yugoslavia, the genocide there, or the ethnic cleansing, and the genocide in Rwanda are very different. It's too often we try to draw these similarities. The way they evolved were very different. One key element that is there, though, is the rise in nationalism and the use of hatred against one ethnic group against another. And that's one commonality that's there, that's shared.
And the goal becomes, of the politicians who are stirring this hornet's nest up, to essentially wipe out another people.
Well, if you look at the former Yugoslavia, I would venture on the part of Milosevic that he wanted a greater Serbia. But I think part of that was he wanted land. And he wanted to expand what was going to be Greater Serbia. So he used the rhetoric of being a nationalist Serb in order to gain greater power and greater land. And Tudjman in Croatia essentially did the same thing.
But they were willing to play with the matches that would light fires that they didn't necessarily control. They set in motion the forces.
Yeah. Well, and in Milosevic's and Tudjman's case, they very much were in control. There's no... I'd be very disappointed if sometime in the future Milosevic is not indicted for war crimes and crimes against humanity in the former Yugoslavia. He knew what was going on and planned it.
So in this post-war World War, post-Cold War chaos, anarchy, whatever, in which the superpowers either can or choose not to intervene, and in which nationalist politicians set in motion these forces, let's look at what the human rights professional does in that context. First of all, it's striking when one reads, for example, in your book, which you did with photographer Gilles Perez, The Graves, on the human rights violations in the former Yugoslavia. What is quite clear, this work requires courage, doesn't it?
I don't know if it requires courage, and my wife might say stupidity, but we call it flakjack archaeology.
I see.
But at any rate, I think it requires courage, but the courage really comes out on the part of the local groups who are dealing with whatever, whether it's Argentina, Guatemala, Cambodia, the former Yugoslavia. It's the local human rights organizations who are out there day after day collecting the information. For those of us who come from the outside, who come in as a forensic team, I mean, when we go into the former Yugoslavia, we're very well protected. We had 55 Dutch military soldiers protecting us and ready to defend us, hopefully, if something happened.
Better than they were defending the Bosnians.
Better than they were defending the Bosnians themselves. So this is, so really, certainly, you know, problems can arise, but it's really those local groups that remain there collecting the evidence day to day that really are the courageous ones.
Now, what's interesting, and again, we're looking at this period from we could call it from Bosnia to Rwanda in a way. The human rights people who've come in increasingly have been international in the sense that they are people who've worked in these different parts of the world where human rights efforts had made. Tell us a little about that process, so that the knowledge gained in training people in Argentina or Guatemala and so on leads to their helping, you know, new groups in the future.
Well, if you look perhaps the trajectory of the human rights movement, if you go back to the late 60s, early 70s, New York Times never ran an article about human rights. Maybe once in a blue moon that something would come out about human rights. And much to the credit to the human rights movement, which I think was bringing together primarily in the beginning lawyers from around the world to try and to frame laws and ways of protecting the rights of people, that this movement then, and also with the development of communications, there's no question that anything to do with the human rights movement, some of the earliest work on the internet or email makes human rights work so much easier because you have isolated small group working in Zambia who might have a land tenure problem they're working on. They want to be able to communicate with somebody in Venezuela, another group, and get that information. So with the growth in communications, the information sharing among all these various groups, and unfortunately, of course, it's turned into a growth industry because the world has become a much more unsafe place in many areas, not perhaps generally, but in certain regions. And so the growth of these human rights organizations has been one that has fulfilled the need that governments weren't going to take. So you take a country like Croatia now. Before the war, there were perhaps 4 or 5 organizations that dealt with civil rights, human rights. Now, after the war, you're into 60, 70, 80 of these organizations, and they're playing the role that the government isn't, and that is they're out there lobbying for civil rights laws and a change in government to protect rather than to persecute citizens.
But they're also, in addition to mobilizing public opinion both within the country and internationally, these teams are going in and performing with the help of locals, performing or supporting locals, I should say, performing the task of getting the story. As Jack Webb used to say in Dragnet, the facts, ma'am, just the facts.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little about that process. What sort of documentation do you have to do to produce the evidence that human rights violations have occurred?
Well, the first issue is who's asking for the evidence. So in Argentina, when this work was developed, and an Argentine team was trained, which still works today in many countries, that team were working for a court, and that court wanted to have evidence of identifying people and determining the cause and manner of death. Essentially, a court wants to know the corpus delicti is, you bring the body forward, this is the homicide victim, whether it was political killing or otherwise. Then you have the alleged perpetrator, and you're trying to connect the two in some way. So you're trying to, one, identify the victim, and that might corroborate eyewitness testimony. And secondly, you're trying to determine how they died. And that could be a single gunshot wound to the head, or it can be multiple gunshot wounds and so on. So you're connecting it, someone was executed by being stood up and machine gunned down, or someone was shot to the head, so on. So these are, it's very specific of what you're looking for a court. When you're working for a truth commission, it may be that you want to learn the numbers of people that disappeared, the numbers of these unmarked graves and so on, to get an idea. It may be less specific. So it all depends on the situation in the country. In the former Yugoslavia and in Rwanda, there are, of course, two international tribunals that are trying suspects there. And each of those suspects are attached to or alleged to have committed mass killings, and the teams that come in are exhuming the graves to collect that physical evidence.
And with that evidence, you want to tell a story, really.
Well, you want to, in any criminal investigation, you've got sort of three types of evidence, just to be clear: testimonial, documentary, and physical. You're collecting the physical evidence, but what becomes key is in dealing with these graves, and is that essentially the last chapter of someone's life remains unwritten. And by carefully using archaeological techniques, exhuming the graves, carefully removing the remains, and taking them to the laboratory, collecting ante-mortem evidence, which can be dental x-rays, old fractures that have been x-rayed, medical histories that show diseases in the bone that might be apparent, and basic things like age, sex, stature, left-handed and right-handedness. All these things that point to you as to who this individual is. What you're doing is essentially you're taking an anonymous skeleton, or the human body has just over 200 bones, you're taking those remains and you're reconstructing who this person is. And part of that is also gathering testimonial evidence. It's interacting with the families. And so as these teams work, it's not just this clinical laboratory work. You become very much involved in who the person is, who you're trying to identify, and you also get involved with learning about the families and what, because for many of these families, the one thing they want is to have the remains returned so they can be given a proper burial. So
that in addition to being evidence in the adjudication of some tribunal, either the national or an international criminal court, this work becomes part of a healing process for the people who've endured these atrocities.
Well, I think it's fascinating to as a writer, observing these forensic scientists who come, and many of them are, just give me the facts sort of attitude, and I've seen them change. Oftentimes in the United States in forensic work, you may not have a lot of contact with the family. That may be carried out by a lawyer and so on. In these situations, the families are always there.
Around the graves, waiting for the unearthing of
Right. What we will do is when we go out into a site, you put a perimeter around, and everyone who's not on the team has to remain outside it. You begin the process of the exhumation. What happens is the families from that community who believe that their loved ones may be buried there come to the perimeter, and they'll bring a basket of lunch and so on and sit at the side and watch, and eventually you watch and see how the team members begin interacting. They'll have to pass through the perimeter and they'll talk to a family member. Sometimes the families will bring photographs, and of course you also need to gather ante-mortem record and information from these families. So as a scientist, a forensic scientist, you begin interacting with them. And in a way, it's an important process. I mean, I've seen it repeatedly in different countries, and that is that the families that disappeared were never in control. They lost their children, they lost their husbands and wives, and they were never able to gain information about it. And here, all of a sudden, is a process that's begun. It's serious, it's done with respect, and they're becoming part of the process by sharing information. And hopefully, eventually, the suffering of their loved one will eventually turn into a trial, or bringing somebody responsible, or that life will, this information will show and demonstrate to the world in hard, concrete terms. I mean, it's hard to argue with a single gunshot wound to the head that this was real. This was not what the military often claimed in Argentina, for example. Oh, these people are off having cappuccinos in Paris. They're not. This is all a lie. Well, this is the hard physical evidence. And this interaction is important. And in Guatemala, sometimes you'd have the entire village turn up. In many of the in the Indian villages, the Mayan community would turn up, and they would say prayers before the work was begun, and at the end of the day, and they would help the team take their tools back through the fields at the end of the day.
So what you're describing is a kind of a multi-layered process. You begin by motivating scientists and professionals to get involved in the work, which is new in this period in the human rights movement we're talking about. But you're also, in essence, motivating the individuals to confront what's been done with them, to attempt to put a cap, on it. But also it's part of a national coming to terms and reconciliation between the parties that have been involved.
Well, let's start with the fact that everything is a process here. And the process is that these are individual forensic scientists, not just from the United States, but from various countries around the world, who may come. In former Yugoslavia, we had 90 forensic scientists from 19 different countries working there. But they've come to another land, and they're getting involved in this work. And they're also interacting with the families. And you see a change in the forensic scientists themselves, which is important. And, as I mentioned earlier, that process of the families. But I think it's important to understand, and this word reconciliation and so on, I almost feel it should be banned from the English language or for use, because what has happened to these families is something that they will be within them almost in a compartment all their lives. They'll never lose that pain. And the important thing is, the question is, who are they reconciling with? They don't really have to reconcile anybody. They were wronged.
Right.
And what they're asking for is justice.
With their own story, in a way.
But is the idea that they're trying to create that something awful happened here. There cannot be impunity. That there's some political responsibility has to be taken. And so the process is to say either it's through a truth commission where you lay out the facts and names may be named, or you go the route of trials where you actually prosecute people. So the way science operates here is one of gathering the facts in a hopefully impartial manner and presenting it forward without the rhetoric that may come from testimony, testimonial evidence, and so on.
This account of the evolution of this process, you can see an evolution, a developmental process. Are you as satisfied with the way institutions have evolved, governmental institutions, to deal with these issues, either at the international level or at the national level?
No, absolutely not. It's clear that the United Nations saved lives in the former Yugoslavia. There's no question that they saved lives, the humanitarian efforts and so on. They also may have prolonged the war, and they also allowed lives to be sacrificed. So it's complex. It's not a, you can't just condemn the United Nations. That's very easy, or all international institutions. But there came a test in a time where there was a need to use force in Bosnia to stop the genocide. There was a time in Rwanda where it was known at the United Nations that something horrible was happening, and there should have been a reaction. The understanding is that the UN is not the United Nations. It's made up of governments, and it was the reluctance of those governments to become involved. So in a way, the pressure has to be on governments to now move swiftly when these sorts of mass violence takes place. I mean, I would venture to say we have to be ready to use the threat of force or force itself to stop genocide.
But when push comes to shove in these processes, what I hear you saying is that it's both national and international civil society that takes the leadership role. Is that a fair way to put it?
Well, they can't take the leadership role in stopping it, but they certainly can play the role in documenting it and also picking up the pieces afterwards.
And also mobilizing public opinion.
And mobilizing
national and international public opinion.
Absolutely. But you see, the former Yugoslavia is such a frustrating example, or Bosnia, because it was probably one of the best covered wars in terms of the media. Every day you turned on the television, opened the newspaper, we knew what was happening. But we were reluctant, meaning the United States, the international community, to really move in and use force to stop a process that could have been stopped or attempted to stop early on in the war.
What will it take? Governmental programs to provide recompense financially, but also emotionally. I guess what I'm trying to get my handle on is you must have a sense of the complexity of what needs to be done, after the processes we've discussed for the society somehow to begin healing.
Right. Well, I think, first of all, to return to, say, a country like Bosnia, that Bosnia, the way it is going to reconstruct itself, or what lies ahead for it in the future, may be very different from Rwanda and very different from other countries. We need to look at each context. And in the context of Bosnia, you have to understand that the ethnic tensions and divisions are stronger now than they ever were before the war, because the war created that. And part of the problem is the logic of politics, that now you vote because it's a Serb, or you vote because it's a Croat, or it's a Bosniak, a Bosnian Muslim. And that until you break that logic of politics down, you're going to continue to harden, much in the way of Northern Ireland, the way people's attitudes. So that's really very crucial. And that means going in there and establishing a political system that is based on voting individual as opposed to someone's ethnic background. And also the other, in Bosnia, it's a devastated country economically, and it's just going to need stability, economic development. It's going to need acknowledgement, meaning first of all, you're going to have to arrest the war criminals and get rid of them, because they continue in government, they continue in the police force. People will not return to certain villages because they know the paramilitary war criminals are still there. You have to get rid of the war criminals, get them out of society, and you also have to have those who don't get prosecuted recognize their responsibility for the atrocities that took place. In some fashion, there has to be an acknowledgement. You can't have it covered up and forgotten about, which is exactly what happened after World War II. The Ustashi and Chetniks, everyone covered that up. Tito would not allow that to be discussed in the schools and so on. But it has to be faced and dealt with. so that children growing up today must realize that they do not revere these nationalist leaders who cause such suffering.
One human rights problem that you've been involved with from the beginning in conceptualizing and then in the programs to solve the problem was the landmine issue. You had gone to Cambodia and reported on that, and you were also involved in the ultimate success of the treaty. Can you give us a sense of your overview of that problem and what it shows us about the strengths and weaknesses of the human rights movement and the environment in which it operates?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the problem itself, and that is, in World War II, there were usually, during a war, 20% of those who were killed were civilians and 80% were combatants. And that's shifted towards the end of this century, where it's now 80% civilians. Warfare is a very intimately fought in the villages, in the communities. And landmines became a very useful weapon in that sort of war, because landmines are a weapon in which you can control people. You can control movement. It's usually used as a defensive weapon, but you can also seal off certain areas and keep yourself protected and keep communities from leaving, because you want to control those communities, and that's its use. Landmines are insidious weapons, unlike artillery, very simple, unlike artillery or bullets and others, is that those you usually aim and you know what you're aiming at. A landmine is left behind. It may have had a purpose of defending a village or a certain area where the troops occupy, but if they're not removed, they then become these silent sentinels. They're there. And when landmines don't distinguish between a footfall of a soldier or a woman collecting firewood or a child. So what's happened is the use of these mines in many of these internal conflicts and international conflicts has been that their fields are littered with them, and they cause a real problem in terms of social reconstruction later on. They're also devastating medically, because most weapons, or let's just say most weapons, but can be dealt with, or let me put it the other way around. Landmines are a particularly insidious weapon because when you step on a landmine, the damage it does is so traumatic in that it's blowing up not only the fragments within the mine, but dirt and other debris up into a wound. And when you get into a hospital where you might be dealing with bullet wounds, where someone is brought in, discharged 3 or 4 days later, a landmine victim arrives, immediately has to be rehydrated with water, has to be taken into surgery, will then come out, probably have to go back into surgery again, is going to have an artificial limb, and if it's a child of 7 or 8 who receives an artificial limb, it may be a change of 20 to 22 limbs throughout their lifetime, and that's an extra cost. Also, landmine victims have to remain in hospital longer for recuperation. And so what you're doing is with these weapons is you're really draining public health resources to deal with developing countries and communicable diseases and so on. And so they've been just devastating in post-war societies. And what was remarkable with the Landmines campaign was that a number of organizations, from environmental organizations to even some demining organizations to human rights organizations, farmers' cooperatives, all of them came together to work for a ban on landmines because they all had a stake in it. In developing countries, and particularly a country like Cambodia, which lives by the rice culture of growing rice, muscle power is extremely important. You have to be able to go out and work in the fields. And to have a population that can't because of landmine injuries. It was devastating. So people recognized the need not only to clean up the mines that were existing, but to bring governments to actually sign a moratorium banning their use. which is still not which still hasn't happened.
So this was a case, because we ultimately got efforts toward an international treaty which the U.S. Has refused to sign. This was a case of documenting the story, telling the story, and mobilizing both national and international opinion about it.
Right. It was trying to not just simply have the landmine victim, the child on the poster, but to make the effort has to be to make people to stop and understand it, and also in some way to realize how maybe not themselves, their immediate community, but their country is involved in this production, or that their country can do something. And a lot of that is focusing on the landmines manufacturers. So the attempt to do in this is to make people understand what happens when you use landmines. I mean, actually, it wasn't a difficult issue, I think, in the United States for our imagination, because we know from Vietnam the devastating effects of landmines there on U.S. soldiers as well as Vietnamese. It was very apparent. And so I think people could understand, you know, really what devastating effects these weapons can have. So it was an easy issue, actually, to organize around.
What's the next phase of the human rights movement?
I have no idea. There's others out there, I'm sure, who have some idea. I think that I think it would be useful, and it's been attempted many times, is to get upstream and to not be exhuming the graves after these atrocities have happened, but is to understand what can be done quickly to prevent periods of mass violence. I think clearly the need to change laws, to national laws to better enforce human rights. Anytime you start seeing in any country arrests of journalists and not having an open press and freedoms, then you want to start getting worried. So start looking at how can you enforce and uphold the freedom of expression and so on. That these are the kind of canary in the mine shaft that lets you know that at some point worse things are going to come once you start closing down the press. So I would definitely say freedom of expression. I think the Internet's going to play a big role in countries like China, getting information in that people normally wouldn't have access to. That'll be a very important area.
How would you tell students to prepare for work as a professional in the human rights field?
Well, probably don't do what I did. Don't have a misspent youth. It's not the same these days. It's a lot harder to get involved in human rights work. I think one is a number of factors. One is definitely learn languages. Key thing is to learn to be focused, immerse yourself. You know, set goals that I'm going to get involved in this aspect if it interests you, and stick to it. I think it's particularly important to get a medical degree and a law degree. But I think more and more social scientists and anthropologists have a lot to offer to our understanding of the root causes of human rights violations. And this is, in fact, here on the Berkeley campus, finding a growing number of social scientists students who are doing dissertation topics related to human rights. And I think this is very encouraging.
So, Eric, what is your view of man and good and evil after all of this work? I guess you started as an absurdist. Have you ended up there?
I'm still an absurdist. I don't know if my opinion has changed at all. I think it's part of the process. You do the work, you document, I actually I'm not optimistic. I'd rather say I'm hopeful. It's not all a dismal picture out there. There have been immense changes in Latin America from what there were 15, 20 years ago. And that was done by groups of people getting together, like the Madres of the Plaza de Mayo and the Vicaria in Chile, and these organizations at great risk themselves, who believed in promoting an ideal which would be that people were not going to, they weren't going to live in societies where the military could rule. So I remain hopeful, and I think that as long as that effort continues, there's some kind of hope.
What moments are the most rewarding for you? Is it the face of a person who you've helped locate their lost one, or is it on the grander scale when some piece of legislation or a criminal court is established or whatever?
I think it's small and it's large, and the small part was watching a 11-year-old girl in Argentina who had been abducted along with her parents. Her parents were killed. The actual abductor was a police chief and had mafia ties and so on. And this little girl was finally located living with this police chief, and we had the grandparents and some of her aunts and uncles. And through the DNA testing, she was reunited. And to be there at the moment when she was reunited with her grandparents was very important to see that. I think also is to see the effort that's now underway to resolve whether or not that Pinochet gets tried in Spain or Chile, but to see that international law has finally come to a point where judges are willing to stand up and say that that he needs to be brought to Spain to stood trial, and that these are important developments. But still keeping in mind there's a lot more to do in the process. And
in all of this, you have to continue to believe in yourself and the ultimate payoff here at both these levels.
Maybe you fool yourself by believing in yourself, but yeah. Well, I think you do in this work is you have collaborations with other like-minded people, and that's what keeps you going.
Eric, thank you very much for taking time to be with us today, and thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.